Hi, I'm Dr. Althea Need Kaminske for the Learning Scientists, and for this month's office hours video, I wanted to talk about the modal model. So the modal model is a term from cognitive psychology, and it basically describes how we think thinking works in a very big picture sense. It's sort of a broad overview of the processes that are involved for us to pay attention and learn and understand something. The reason why I want to talk about it today is because I recently submitted a paper where we talked about the effects of cell phones on attention. Does it matter if it's your phone or someone else's phone, right? What are all these conditions? And in the paper, we described how this is a really important thing to know for educators because this would affect learning. And one of the reviews we got back on it was a comment that said, "I don't understand. This paper is about attention, but you say it affects learning," right? I thought this was about learning. And I was a little taken aback by this comment. So I asked my co-author, who's a professor in the School of Education, I said, "What do they mean? How does attention affect learning?" "Of course it affects learning. It's the first step in learning." Do we really have to, like spell out the modal model and really describe this process? It seems really basic. And he said, "Yeah, actually they probably haven't heard of it before." And I thought, oh, well, that makes sense because this isn't a cognitive psychology journal, it's an educational psychology journal. So I had to take a step back and say, oh, okay, this maybe isn't obvious to everyone else. So I thought it might be a good video because it's again, pretty basic concept. And it's based on research that's been around for a really long time. So it seemed very standard and obvious to me, but not so much to other people. So again, the modal model, it's called modal because it's just sort of the most common model that we use. There are sort of different takes on this. It's been around for a long time. It was originally proposed by Atkinson and Schifrin in 1968. So there's been plenty of time for updates and sort of tweaks on it. So it's not, the model that I'm going to describe today is not the exact same model from 1968, but that's the basis of it. So the basic model is that we more or less have these different sort of stages in the process of learning or thinking about something. The first stage, the first step is really attention and perception kind of rolled into one. It's really difficult to separate those two things. But basically, something happens in your world and you recognize that something is happening in your world and you should be paying attention to it. Of course, your ability to recognize it, your ability to devote priority to it, to pay attention to it, right? All of those things are going to be affected by lots of different factors, but that's like step one. Something's happening. Pay attention to it. The next thing, the next stage then is your working memory, which really acts as this interface between what's going on right now, the present moment, and your past experiences that might relate to that present moment. So let's say you're reading a book and you're trying to focus your attention on that, right? So first you have to pay attention to the book. If you're like me, you have to like carve out an hour or two just to like sit down to maybe not do something else and maybe focus on it. And while you're reading the book, you have to block out sounds. You have to try not to think about other things that you're supposed to do today. Instead, just actually pay attention to the book that you're reading. So when you're doing that, if you've succeeded in that, then your working memory is going to be going through and going, oh, okay, all right, focus on this. This seems to be a high priority. Oh, I recognize this new word or term. This seems a lot like this thing that I read before, or this sounds really familiar because of some other thing, right? We generally have context for the things that we're experiencing. And if we don't, we have some problems processing it. If it's totally new for us, if we don't recognize any of the terms or words and the context is totally unfamiliar, we struggle to understand it and then to remember it later. So hopefully we recognize and understand what's going on. And so our working memory, in order to do that, is pulling from our long-term memory, right? It's going through our brain thinking, okay, how is this familiar? What is this thing like? And in doing that and trying to go through and access those memories, it's of course updating them and forming new memories, making it more likely that this thing that you're paying attention to right now, that you're using your working memory to kind of understand and assess, you might be able to remember this thing later. Now, for the purpose of today's video, we're just talking about maybe the first time you encountered something, the first time you're learning something. So you only have kind of a slim chance at now remembering this thing later, at getting it from long-term memory later. To increase those chances, you'll need to do things like retrieval practice, space practice, interleaving, right? Lots of other things we talk about the learning scientists to improve the long-term memory. But for now, to keep it simple, we'll say this is the first time you're learning something. You're going into class one day and you're learning about, the Krebs cycle in biology. So first, you have to pay attention to what's going on in front of you. The teacher's talking. Maybe I should pay attention to the teacher. Is the teacher writing something up on the board? Does it look familiar? Do I at least understand the words that are going up there so that I can write them down and maybe understand the process and the cycle that's happening? What does this relate to that I've encountered in the past, right? All of those things are happening all at once. And of course, this isn't just one direction, right? It's not like you pay attention and then you just automatically get all the rest of it for free. Instead, remember that a working memory is sort of like this buffer between the present and the past. Your working memory system is also kind of setting priorities for you and helping you juggle different things in your head and saying, okay, I see that the teacher's writing something up on the board, so I'm going to pay attention to that. But I also kind of notice that there's this interesting conversation going on behind me, and maybe I'm going to notice that too. And maybe I'm able to block that out for the most part until they say a name of somebody that I recognize. And now I'm sorry, my attentional priorities have shifted. Working memory has just now decided that we don't really need to pay attention to what's going on up there. I need to pay attention to what's going on back there, right? So your priorities are always shifting, and your ability to kind of process and say, okay, this is something that I flagged as important. I'm going to continue to pay attention to it, or maybe not pay attention to it, whatever the case is. Kind of depends also on your working memory and the context that you're in, and what and how it relates to past memories or events. So if you decide that the thing that's going on right now isn't really relevant to your interests, you don't really understand it anyways, you're going to stop paying attention to it, right? So it's not like once you pay attention, again, that things just roll on down this track and you're automatically going to remember it all later, right? It's kind of goes both ways. You set these priorities, there's a little feedback loop. Again, this model's been around for a long time, so there's been all kinds of updates and nuanced understandings of how these different aspects of our thinking, learning work together. But the basic idea is still pretty sound. First, you have attention. Then you have your working memory or short-term memory, right? Stuff that's going on right now. And that interfaces with stuff that happened in the past so that you can access that stuff to understand what's happening right now, but also so that you can remember what's happening now later and put it in the past once you get to that point. So that's the basics of the modal model, again, and why I think it's important to understand, because attention is really the first step in learning, which is why even though I'm a memory person, I'm a learning scientist, I'm still really interested in attention and perception because they obviously play a very important role in how we're going to remember something later. The way I've always thought about it is like, it seems really obvious, but it's kind of like saying that reading comprehension goes up when you turn the lights on in a room, right? That there are some like prerequisites that need to be met before we're able to get to the kind of like meat of how learning and memory work, and attention is really that first step. So I hope this overview of what we call the modal model, or sort of the common model of how learning and memory and attention work together, was useful. And I hope it gives you a little bit more context for why we occasionally bring up these attention and perception topics on the blog. So yeah, thank you guys.